The United States has a Space Force. It has generals, it has bases, it has uniforms, it operates some of the most sophisticated spacecraft ever built. But there's one thing you might expect a Space Force to have that it doesn't: astronauts. Well, technically it does. 3 NASA astronauts have served in the Space Force. But here's the important part. They aren't Space Force astronauts performing Space Force missions. They're NASA astronauts who just happen to wear a Space Force uniform. The people operating America's military spacecraft are overwhelmingly sitting on Earth. And there's a very good historical reason for that. But that reason may be fast disappearing. The modern Space Force didn't really begin in 2019. Its institutional DNA goes back decades into the United States Air Force. During the Cold War, the Air Force seriously explored putting military personnel into space. The X-20 Dyna-Soar would have given the Air Force a piloted spaceplane. The Manned Orbiting Laboratory would have placed military astronauts on board an orbiting reconnaissance station. We've already discussed Orion. Air Force officers became astronauts. The military participated extensively in the space shuttle program. There was once a very real possibility that military space power would develop around people operating in space. But it didn't. Instead, the satellite won. And there were excellent reasons why. If you want to photograph another country, why risk a pilot when an unmanned spacecraft can do it? If you want missile warning, communications, navigation, weather information, or signals intelligence, why build a spacecraft capable of keeping human beings alive in orbit? Machines were cheaper. They could remain in orbit longer. Nobody died if one failed. So military space evolved around satellites rather than astronauts. And the organization responsible for military space evolved with it. That history created something very strange. America eventually created an independent military service responsible for space, whose personnel almost never actually go there. Think about how unusual that is. Sailors go to sea, soldiers operate on land, airmen fly through the air, but Guardians operate spacecraft thousands of miles away while sitting at consoles in places like Colorado Springs. That's not an insult. It's an extraordinary sophisticated mission, but it reflects a particular technological era, the era when almost everything useful in space was a robot. The question is whether that era is ending. Consider Starship. Forget for a moment the arguments about Mars. The important thing about Starship isn't Mars, it's scale. SpaceX is attempting to build a reusable transportation system capable of moving enormous quantities of cargo and eventually large numbers of people into space. Whether Starship itself fulfills that promise isn't really the point. Someone eventually will. And when transportation becomes cheap enough and frequent enough, the nature of space power changes. Imagine dozens of commercial stations, fuel depots, manufacturing facilities, research laboratories, tourist facilities, mining operations, habitats around the moon, hundreds and eventually thousands of Americans living and working beyond the atmosphere. Suddenly, entirely new military problems appear. Who rescues Americans stranded in orbit? Who inspects a suspicious spacecraft? Who protects strategically important infrastructure? Who provides security for military logistics operating between the Earth and the Moon? Who commands military operations when the people, equipment, and objectives are physically located in space? Those aren't simply satellite missions. They're human missions. And eventually, some of them may require personnel who aren't merely controlling spacecraft from Earth. They may require military professionals whose operating environment is outer space itself. And this creates a problem the Space Force should probably start thinking about now. Because military organizations do not automatically inherit new missions simply because those missions appear to belong to them. If thousands of Americans begin working in space while the Space Force remains almost entirely an Earth-based satellite service, other institutions will fill the gap. NASA will possess decades of human spaceflight experience. Commercial companies will operate the vehicles. Contractors may build and maintain the infrastructure. And the other military services may discover that their existing missions simply extend upward. The Navy protects American commerce at sea. What happens when American commerce moves between Earth and the Moon? The Air Force moves troops and cargo throughout the atmosphere. What happens when military transportation routinely crosses into orbit? The Army protects installations and populations. What happens when some of those installations aren't on Earth? If the Space Force hasn't already developed the doctrine, personnel, training, and organizational concepts for human military spaceflight, it may discover that somebody else will. And then comes a very uncomfortable question. What exactly is a Space Force for if everyone except the Space Force is actually operating in space? This is not merely a question about astronauts. It's a question about institutional survival of the Space Force itself. None of this means that the Space Force should create astronaut squadrons tomorrow. That might be slightly premature. The missions may not exist yet. The vehicles may not be ready. And the economics may never develop exactly as enthusiasts predict. But military planning exists precisely because waiting until a capability is urgently required is too late. The Space Force can begin now. Study human military operations in space. Develop doctrine. Wargame rescue, inspection, logistics, security, and command missions. Determine what career fields would be necessary. Decide what should remain commercial, what should belong to NASA, and what genuinely requires military personnel. And perhaps most importantly, start developing guardians who think about space not simply as a place where satellites orbit, but as a place where human beings will soon live, work, compete, and fight. For 70 years, America's military space organizations adapted themselves to a world in which machines went into space and people mostly stayed home. At the time, this was probably the correct decision. But institutions can become prisoners of the technologies that create them. The satellite age created today's Space Force. The next age may be different. The Space Force doesn't need thousands of astronauts today. It may not even need dozens. What it does need is a plan for the moment when military space power stops being something we project into space from Earth and becomes something Americans actually do in space. Because if that future arrives and the Space Force isn't ready for it, the future may find someone else to do its job. I'm Brent Zarnick, and this is Frontiers of Power. If you enjoy exploring forgotten documents, overlooked strategic ideas, and the history of frontiers that shaped our world, from long-gone Rio Grande trade empires to humanity's next steps into the solar system, over land, sea, air, and space, please consider subscribing. I'm Brent Zarnick, and this is Frontiers of Power. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next frontier.